Hello, I welcome you to this edition of Counselor's Corner. This time, in this edition, I'm going to ask this question and answer it also. Does birth order affect the temperament? Does birth order affect the temperament? Now, as we've already discussed in previous editions, we know that God establishes the temperament in every single person upon conception as they are growing in the womb. Each person has been given by God their own temperament. But God also determines the amount of children we're going to have and the order in which they are born. And that is something we need to consider because that also affects the temperament. So there are differences, of course, in behavior relative to each child. Now, those of you who may be parents already, maybe you've raised several children, you might recognize what I'm about to say to you. Those of us who were raised, and I can relate to a lot of what I'm about to tell you from my own growing up because I am the oldest of three children. And what I'm going to do is demonstrate for you some of the behaviors that happen between parents and children and how that can affect their temperament. And I'm just going to do this briefly. So because there are differences in behavior for each one of the children, it does affect how their temperament forms. And so here's what I want to show you is this. But understand this first. The differences in behavior are not affected by economic conditions, by religious status, by any kind of spiritual belief. They're more or less universal, and I think you'll see what I mean in a moment. Now, the truth that a child takes on here, and I wrote down some things. A child gets traits, and those traits stay with that child well into adulthood, and very often until they die, because those traits and those characteristics are so ingrained in them at a young age. So I'm going to give you an example of three children. We're going to look at the firstborn child, the middle child, and of course the lastborn child, or the baby of the family. And just so you know, in case you're curious, I happen to be the first child of three. I have a younger brother and a younger sister. So I'm the first child. So I'm going to explain to you and show you what more or less happens with the first child. For those of you who are parents, can you remember the excitement you felt with your very first child? Everything changed in your life. You were setting up a baby shower. You were redecorating or painting a nursery. All of a sudden, that child, everything in your life changed. Everything was focused on that first baby that was coming. And of course, as parents, we want better for our children than what we had. And so our focus, everything goes into it. All the anticipation goes right into that first child. And that's normal because we're producing life. We're producing another generation. And no matter what age you're at, when you have that first child that you bring into the world, there is no other feeling like that. When you see that little baby that is born, that you nurtured in the womb for 9 months. So what happens is this. Very often, parents will, I don't want to say spoil, but they look towards those children and they do this to them. They want their children to have the best education, to excel at sports, to go to the finest college, to marry the nicest person, to have a great career. In other words, they instill in those children this drive and this determination to succeed because it's your first child. Perfectly natural. Here's where it affects temperament. If your child happens to have a temperament that may be a little bit more, let's say, in control, like a choleric, you are going to raise a child who is very determined, very focused, will go after goals, will be relentless in doing that. They'll be striving all the time and driving for something else. They'll be very independent. But suppose your first child has a temperament that's more laid back, like a melancholy. Well, what's going to happen with that is they will still achieve because you're still instilling that in them. The problem is that they will start feeling that they can never measure up. They'll always be second best. And it's not something that you did as a parent, it's their temperament. But that's how sometimes how we do things with our children affects the temperament. So that's the first child. And I will tell you, I was the first child. So I was raised where, yes, my parents wanted the best for me and so on. And I was very driven. And to this very day, I am driven to do things. And that's just part of my temperament. But let me show you what happens with the middle child. The middle child's a little different. because now the parents have some experience under their belt. Now the parents have an idea of how to parent. And so very often the parents are more laid back. They're more hands off. They're less involved maybe with the second child than the first child because they've corrected some of their mistakes and maybe they felt they were a little overbearing and so they back off a little bit. Now here's what happens with the middle child, okay? Because a parent knows much better and they know what works and what doesn't work. But very often, here's what happens with the middle child. They're often very measured against the success of the first child. So very often that middle child loses their identity somewhere. And the middle child has a tendency to look outside the family for approval, for to reach their goals, to feel like they are something, to find their identity outside. If a child has a serious temperament, they're going to seek to compete outside the family in the workforce, maybe through another family, marrying into another family. They've got to find their identity. If they're more outgoing, then a lot of times they're going to be rebellious at home. I don't know if those of you have multiple children, but sometimes the second one is more rebellious because a lot of attention was paid to the first one. And maybe the second one gets a little short shrift. I can tell you this, that my younger brother was an entrepreneur at a very young age. And it's very interesting as I'm studying more and more about temperament and I'm learning about this, it is fascinating to know and to see that he really did go off and create his own identity to this very day. He's an entrepreneur. He married off, successful marriage, kids. He's a grandfather now. But I saw him now move off and identify himself through that based on his temperament always. You see, the middle child is always trying to find their identity because they get lost between the first child and what I'm about to tell you of the last child. Now, here's the other thing when it comes to the last child or the baby of the family. I don't know, maybe you can relate to this. Maybe you were the baby of your family. But here's what happens. By the time the last child comes around, maybe it's baby number 4, 5, 8, maybe it's just the third one. But the last child, the parent starts realizing they're a little older, of course. They have much more experience because they've raised several children at this point. But what happens is a lot of times the parents will take almost like a hands-off approach. Maybe they're getting a little older, whatever the child does is always measured against what their older siblings did. And I don't know if maybe you're a younger child and you can relate to this. But what happens is the youngest child, very often, if they have a certain kind of temperament, they will cling to the parents and want to stay close by. Now, parents, if I'm talking to you, when you had your last child and maybe some of your older children got married or went into the service and moved away, and now you have the baby left at home, how many times have you ever thought to yourself where you said, I don't want to lose my last child. I don't want my baby to leave because then I'll be an empty nester. I want my youngest child, my baby, to stay around a little bit longer. We start putting those things into them. And what happens is, based on their temperament, they may cling to you and want that close relationship and never lose sight of you and always want to be there. That is a risk that we take as far as we're raising children. So a lot of times a child in this case may become selfish. They may become immature, childish. They never really grow up because we don't allow them to grow up, you see. We want them with us because we don't want to lose that last child. But so what happens is the youngest child in a certain kind of temperament will always seek the attention of the parents. Now, if their temperament is more serious, they cling to the parents. And if they're less serious, very often they become the class clown. They become undisciplined. They become unruly. They're trying to get your attention. Imagine being the last child and you have older brothers or sisters. You probably lived with hand-me-downs. You probably got secondhand things, and maybe you didn't get as much attention as some of your older siblings. Well, that would cause you, based on your temperament, to act out or to seek attention or not to be in too much of a hurry to leave home. And that is how birth order can affect the temperament. Now, I just gave you one set of scenarios. Of course, there are many different ways that we can look at this. But if you are curious about what your temperament is, if you're curious about your spouse or your children, I can help you with all of that. You can visit me at our website, livinginharmonyministries.org, livinginharmonyministries.org. Some of you have already taken your temperament assessment, and you know now what your temperament is. And I hope by knowing that, you have greater insight as to who you are and how God made you. But if you are interested in finding out how to do that, I can help you. I'm a licensed pastoral counselor. I'm a certified temperament counselor, and I'm here to help you. Please visit the website. Look at all the things that we're doing, not only for individuals, but also for church corporations and church bodies. We are here to serve the body of Christ. So I want to thank you for taking a few minutes to be with me here in this Counselor's Corner. Feel free to share the video if you'd like, and I thank you for being with me. God bless you.